comics.
Because they have no bones.
It's Captain's Log 51758.3, and I am Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White, and this is the podcast We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. Find us on social media at Boneless Comics Podcast or on X at Boneless Comics 1.
That's right. And you can also transport over to our extra content on bonelesscomicspodcast.com. And you can also look for our after shows and bonus content on our YouTube channel at Boneless Comics Podcast. And then also just make sure that you hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell as well. So that way you're getting all of the updates, because we are a clean comic book podcast where we chat about comics from Marvel, DC, IDW, Dark Horse, Image, and more. So we have a lot of content out there. We're starting to wrap up our 4th season, and we're going to go into our 5th season next year. So let us know what you think, tell your friends, and hit all the buttons.
Awesome.
Let's get into our review of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Dog of War, written by Mike Chen with art by Angel Hernandez, published in 2023 by IDW Publishing. So Star Trek Deep Space Nine, or DS9, is an American science fiction television series in the Star Trek franchise, which originally aired from 1993 to 1999, spanning 176 episodes over 7 seasons. So kind of like our last episode where we went over the X-Files, that was a TV show from the 90s. This is also a TV show from the 90s, but the comic book is from current times. But it's different because with X-Files, we were kind of like thrusting them into the 21st century, whereas Star Trek takes place in the 24th century, where Earth is part of the Galactic United Federation of Planets, and Deep Space Nine's narrative is centered on the Cardassian space station Deep Space Nine, which is located adjacent to the planet Bajor and a wormhole connecting the Federation territory to the Gamma Quadrant on the far side of the Milky Way galaxy. So this is a specific spin-off, if you will, of the Star Trek or Star Trek The Next Generation television series that we're going to be talking about today. If you want more content and more of our thoughts and opinions on Star Trek at large, because we're huge Star Trek fans, I don't know if you can tell, but you can also check out our 3-part after show on YouTube, where we explore the history and our opinions and all that good stuff on the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, it is pretty long too, so bear with us if you're not ready for a deep dive. It's a deep dive on our thoughts on the entire franchise. So one thing you mentioned before that I wanted to bring up is that this is a very specific point in time. Deep Space Nine specifically is more serialized than Star Trek the original series, Star Trek The Next Generation, or Star Trek Voyager. So what they've done with this comic is set it within a specific point in time during the run of the show. So there's going to be spoilers for things that happen in the show. That's kind of unavoidable because the events that are going on are very much in the middle of that section that's very serialized. So knowing that, let's give you a little bit of background on the characters. And I've decided not to go down the entire cast list for the show, because another thing that sets Deep Space Nine apart is that not only does it have, a pretty decent size main cast, but they have the biggest guest cast of any of the shows still today. So if I were to give you a list of every character that is on Deep Space Nine, we would be here for the whole episode. So we're just not going to do that. But the main ones that you need to be aware of for this episode are Captain Benjamin Lafayette Sisko. He is the commander of Deep Space Nine. Again, it's a Federation outpost that guards the Bajoran wormhole. And there he is, Commander Sisko before he was promoted.
Yeah.
And so we're further along now, and now he's Captain Sisko. And one of the main ways you can tell that is because he has a goatee. So that that happened right around the time of the promotion. So while Sisko was initially resistant to this posting, Sisko has come to develop a deep love for the Bajoran people, and has even become an important figure in their faith, the emissary of the prophets. So prior to his posting on Deep Space Nine, he lost his wife Jennifer to the Borg attack on Wolf 359. And that's actually a pretty relevant story point for this story in particular. So just keep in mind that he did lose his wife to the Borg. He actually blames Captain Picard for this somewhat, as Picard's assimilation by the Borg allowed Starfleet to be compromised so completely.
We met before. Yes, sir. We met in battle. I was on the Saratoga at Wolf 359.
And so at this point in history, Cisco is currently spearheading the war between the Federation and the Dominion, who are kind of like the anti-Federation. They're kind of like a collection of races that are all about conquest and domination, and hence the Dominion, as opposed to the Federation, who want to cooperate with other races. So, and his other ally in the war, that's kind of like a guy at the top, is Starfleet Admiral Ross, who will also figure into this story. So we have Quark, who is Deep Space Nine's Ferengi bartender and entrepreneur. Quark has often been described as a shade of gray, and he is very much that. He's kind of a morally ambiguous character at times. He's motivated by profit and his devotion to the Ferengi rules of acquisition. And so Quark lives by his principles, but finds them constantly being challenged by the humans and Bajorans around him.
Humans.
And exactly, and they call them humans. And so one thing that Armin Shimmerman said recently in an interview that I heard where he was on the Delta Flyers podcast is, which if you haven't checked that out and you're into Star Trek, it's a great podcast for getting a little behind the scenes peek at how the shows are made, because the actor that plays Quark is one of the main people on there. But he said that he finds Quark to be one of the most principled people on the show. He's like, now that doesn't mean according to our human morality, but according to his Ferengi morality, he has these rules that he lives his life by, and he will live or die by those rules, basically. So the rules of acquisition are his moral code. Yeah, there you go. The Ferengi rules of acquisition. So
number 40, she can touch your lobes, but never your latinum. Words to live by. That was just a random one I pulled up in the book. So
that was a great one to pull up randomly. So yeah, so that's Quark does have his own value system. It is not anything like our value system, but it's very important to him. And so while he rarely admits to care for anyone or anything beyond profit, at this point in Deep Space Nine, he's starting to kind of soften up a little bit, although he went through all of those changes kicking and screaming. So in this story, he's responsible for setting off the events involving Latinum. And Latinum is normally a form of currency, but in this story, it is a rare, genetically perfect, purebred corgi from Earth that shows up on the station as part of a deal that Quark is making. So, well, if we refer to Laddie or Latinum, a lot of times in this story, yeah, they call him Laddie for short. That's the corgi. We're not talking about the currency unless we otherwise state it. So, we also have Alacia. She is a Betazoid member of a galactic animal rights group, which is actually interesting. We've never seen something like that on Star Trek before. So she's looking to protect Latinum and other animals that are outside the lines on the map drawn by the Federation and their Protected Species Act. And then finally, the last kind of important element that you don't see in the show that's a part of this story are the brokers. And they're basically black market information brokers that deal as go-betweens with rich clients in order to ship like rogue technology and other data that they can use to sell to the highest bidder. So as you'll see in this story, Laddie is being shipped around and sold, as people buy dogs and things like that. But there's something a little bit else going on with the brokers. So, and they have no qualms about dealing with all sides in the current Federation and Dominion war. So those are the major characters that you need to know about in our story today.
Yeah, the show tends to get very political as far as what's going on in the show. Like, it doesn't necessarily resemble any one particular moment in history, although there are, resemblances. But once the story gets cooking, I mean, it's pretty much about the Federation and the Dominion. But it's really cool to see kind of these side stories of, what the Ferengi are doing, or organizations like the Brokers, where there's entities out there that are trying to stay kind of out of the conflict, but also trying to make money during the conflict, which is pretty typical. So this is kind of that incident where we're taking a moment out of this war to kind of have a little side adventure, if you will, and kind of see, what's going on outside of that. But it really, this one directly does kind of tie into the story at large of what's going on. So this takes place somewhere about like the last 6 episodes or so of season 6 of the TV show, again during the Dominion War. There are a couple things that they say or do or have that kind of pinpoint where this is located, but it's somewhere within that vicinity. So, having just recovered from the loss of Space Station Deep Space Nine, the Dominion launched a surprise invasion of Beta Z from the Calandra sector, capturing the planet in less than 10 hours. With control of this key Federation member world, the Dominion had scored a decisive strategic success. It was now in a position to launch offensives against Vulcan, Andor, Tellar, Alpha Centauri, so major member worlds in the Federation.
We just received a Priority 1 communication from Starfleet Command. Dominion has invaded Beta Z. With Beta Z in the hands of the Jem'Hadar, the Dominion is in a position to threaten Vulcan, Andor, Tellar, Alpha Centauri. If we ever needed a new ally, it's right now.
So at this point in our overarching story, suffering from shortages of ships and manpower, being defeated over and over again, and then once again, with Beta Z being captured, the Federation, it kind of seemed like was going to be defeated, and it was just a matter of time. Like we've sort of been building this story point for a while, even in Star Trek Insurrection, where they're like, the Federation is old. Every major power has tackled it, and so we're kind of looking toward the, are we going to see the end of the Federation? So this is like a really serious and major point within our overall story. So our heroes have just recovered the station. They're searching for anything left behind that might aid them in their fight against the Dominion, and that's where the story in this comic book takes place. So we have an extremely rare purebred corgi from Earth that makes its way aboard Deep Space Nine when Quark cuts a deal to procure it for a high buyer. After all, a Ferengi without profit is no Ferengi at all, according to the rules of acquisition.
And that is a rule of acquisition, yes.
Yes. But Latinum the Corgi comes with unexpected cargo that shakes Captain Benjamin Sisko to the core, a Borg component discovered by a crew sent to uncover Cardassian technology after the station's reoccupation. And Quark comments that the component allowed him to hear the Borg hive mind. So Sisko is asked to turn it over to Starfleet, but he refuses because he's fearful that an ambitious admiral might foolishly try to harness it for the war effort with the Dominion and with Cardassia. But it backfires when mercenaries show up to steal the Corgi and the tech, which has conveniently recorded sensitive data from the station's computer. So Sisko and the team board the Defiant. They mount a rescue effort for the device, their data, and the Corgi, of course, because at this point it's kind of become like almost like a cast member, if you will, or a family member. So Sisko manages to delete the data, and the team rescues the Corgi before Sisko loses his mind to the tech, because this is Borg stuff. So it's like your regular human mind is not capable of processing what this device can do, basically. So back on the station, Sisko says, you know what, tell Starfleet the interface was damaged and we're going to destroy it because any individual is too fallible to wield the power of the collective. No military asset is worth that risk. And that's sort of his conclusion at the end of the story. Meanwhile, we have Bashir, who tinkers with the Corgi's DNA by splicing a gene with a single insignificant change, which makes him no longer genetically perfect. And so now the buyer is no longer interested in him as merchandise. So now they get to keep him. But then they decide, well, I don't really have time to take care of him. How about you? Well, I don't. Well, I don't. And I don't. So then he's adopted by Morn, and they live happily ever after?
I guess so.
So that's pretty much a summation of our story. We'll give you more details when we get into the discussion, but until then, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
All right.
This is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Captain Benjamin Sisko and his crew are leading the battle against an unholy alliance, the Dominion and the Cardassians. The survival of the entire Alpha Quadrant is at stake. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Season 6.
We will keep on fighting until we can't fight anymore.
This is Star Trek as you've never seen it before. On video from Paramount.
All right, well, to lead us off, when we're looking at a media adaptation, one of the things that we're always concerned about is, did the tone of it feel consistent with the TV show? And this one definitely has action and humor, which is not always the tone of Deep Space Nine, but how did you feel as far as them kind of matching up with the way the show is?
Well, a lot of times when we review something where, it ties into a TV show or a movie, I usually try to watch it beforehand to sort of get back into the universe. And then that way, when I read the comic, it's sort of like easy to make that distinction. But with Deep Space Nine, I mean, I had rewatched it recently within the last several years anyway.
Yeah.
But even so, I was just like, I don't think I want to go back and rewatch this because I feel like I know it so well.
Yeah.
But when I was reading the comic, I was thinking of that question in my mind because I kind of felt like there was something that I couldn't pinpoint that just didn't quite feel like the show for me, but I wasn't sure what exactly it was. Did you feel the same way?
So for me, the big thing that I look for is the writer writing in the character's voice. And I felt like the motivations and the actions that the characters were taking all felt consistent to me with their portrayals on the show. But the actual dialogue itself occasionally felt a little bit stiff compared to maybe what we would get on the show, which might be a little more well thought out and more well reasoned for that character. Sisko was the main one where I had trouble putting some of the words in his mouth because I was trying to imagine Avery Brooks delivering some of these lines, and it was a little bit more difficult for me with him than the other characters for whatever reason. Quark seemed like he was pretty much on model
for some reason, especially for me didn't work for some reason, especially with his security logs at the beginning of each issue.
Odo, I don't think was really a big enough part of this story that I even super noticed it. I did think it was a little bit silly that we had a moment where he, Kira's like, go and have fun, and he like becomes the corgi as well on the holodeck to like play with the other corgi. But they did have conversations on the show about when he was with the other changelings about like, well, you should become a hawk, you should become this rock, you should do those things because then you know what it's like to be that thing. And that is like a part of changeling culture.
Sure.
But I couldn't remember if at this point in the show he and Kira were like together or not, or if that was further down the line.
I think they are. I think this is like shortly after their first kiss on the promenade. Like I think we're very fresh in that story. So if that's the case, I can see that making sense. But just kind of like plucking it out of time, it's like, well, does that really fit?
There is that, except there's a whole episode, and it's much further down the line, to my memory, where basically he reveals that he's never truly relaxed around her because he still doesn't feel comfortable going into his liquid state or turning into something else because he's like, I don't want to remind people that I'm not like them, basically. And even with you. And that was like a character development moment that they had to like move past later. So I kind of felt like at this point in the story, especially if they were fresh on that, he wouldn't be just like changing shape in front of her like freely like that. So that felt a little bit out of character to me. Although one thing that I thought about was they don't have to worry about budget with Odo for like the first time ever, because every time he shapeshifted, it was like really expensive, which is why they wrote things into his character for why he didn't do it very often, basically, because they kind of like went nuts with it in like the first episode where they have like the spike ball thrown through him, and then they have him go into a grate and turn into a rat. And he was like a painting at one point, came down the wall because he was listening to Quark. And they realized like very quickly early on in the show that like, oh, we can't afford to keep doing this every episode. Like it's going to get really expensive because this is pretty close to when Terminator 2 came out, and that was a movie budget trying to do the same kind of effect. So obviously on a TV show, they didn't have the money to do that. So I did think it was cool, and they could have like pushed his shape-shifting stuff further. But they actually come up with a reason late in the story why he can't go on the mission, because they need him back on the Defiant for whatever reason. And I felt like that was more the writer going, I don't want to ruin the drama of this situation by having Odo just be able to do everything super easily. So he had a reason why he had to stay behind. But the dialogue was the thing to me that I kind of dialed in on for like, it doesn't quite sound like the voice of the characters.
Yeah.
And this show, they have really distinctive voices. So it's going to be noticeable on a Deep Space Nine adaptation versus another one of the Trek shows.
Yeah. It kind of just made me feel like I was reading something that was a part of or based on that universe, but what didn't quite necessarily like plucking out an episode of the show and fitting right in. But I don't think it was enough to ruin it. Like I wasn't reading through it going, I didn't like it. I was just like, something feels off here, but it's not enough to deter me from reading through. I mean, and the book the comic itself is about a corgi on this futuristic space station. So that alone kind of like separates it from, especially the tone of season 6, like maybe tone of season 1 or 2, where they did some weird things like a la Marine and count to 10 and all of that stuff. But
that's Avery Brooks has gone on record as saying that's his most hated moment of the entire show, and for a lot of the fans as well. I do want to remind you that Deep Space Nine did, maybe more than the other shows, they would have really serious episodes, but then they would go for like really broad comedy episodes with the Ferengi. And right before season 6 started, so like the episode right before the season 5 finale, when they're kind of going, the war is inevitable, we know what's going to happen, we had one of the silliest episodes ever where Jake is going on a quest to find a Willie Mays baseball card for his father, and has to go through a whole bunch of stuff, and there's the soulless minions of orthodoxy and the guy that's trying to attain immortality.
And he looks at Wayne. Do you?
He's like, no. So I do think that this is a show where they did feel the freedom to go for comedic moments like that. So this isn't necessarily something that they wouldn't do. Even in season 7, we have the baseball episode where Sisko's like, I'm going to beat this Vulcan captain at my own game. The only reason he's here is to like rub it in my face that he does everything better than me. And so they had that episode, and then they also had the one where they went to save Vic's program on the holodeck, and they all had to dress up in period attire, and that was in the last season as well. So Deep Space Nine does do the comedy thing every once in a while. I think this one stands out because it's not broad comedy, and it's not just purely serious. It was like somewhere in between, and I feel like the show doesn't tend to do that. They tend to kind of like, here's the tone for the episode, and we're going to go with that for this episode. So it was kind of an interesting mix of both, and ultimately, while the corgi is on the cover, I felt like Laddie was kind of a minor part of the story overall.
It was
like
really the Borg implant that was the important part.
That was
the
really,
corgi was like the selling point. Like, check this out, we have a corgi.
Yeah. So that was kind of like how, and it felt like how they were trying to sell the story to consumers as well. Like, hey, this is going to be a part of the story. And like, he's cute and everything, and it was funny that Morn adopted him, but overall, he didn't really have a big impact on the story, except that everybody kind of got a little break to like spend time with a dog, I guess.
And talk about how he had like made them feel, and because that was part of the they had to go get the Borg tech, and Starfleet was like, we don't care about the dog, but they were like, you know, we're definitely making this a part of our mission, that we're going to find Latinum and we're going to rescue him, because we don't leave people behind. Like, it turned into like suddenly, you know, like he was a member of the crew, like, we're not leaving somebody behind, we're going to get him.
I mean, I'm glad that they didn't give him up, because one thing you didn't mention in the story synopsis is that Quark finds out later on that actually poachers are going to be getting him, and they're going to taxidermy him. So they are going to kill him whenever Quark hands him off. So that was like, oh, we don't want to see it go that way. So I was glad that they rescued him, but ultimately that wasn't where the dramatic tension lied. It was more to do with like the Borg implant. What is Sisko going to do about it? Is it going to dredge up old memories, and, you know, that kind of thing. So
I think that was the trouble I had, because it was a mix of the two, and so it was kind of like I was expecting one or the other. Like, either I want to have a serious Borg episode about this implant and its implications and what the moral gray area is, you know, surrounding this, and do we do it, do we not? Let's wrestle with it for a while and then decide what to do in the end. And the corgi was more of like a B story, but I don't know. Like, I kind of wish that they had picked one or the other for this, for the comic. Although, would the corgi have had enough to carry 5 issues? I don't know, but
I don't know. It felt like whenever, and Deep Space Nine has been accused of doing this too, but it's not a favorable quality of the show. But sometimes they will have a B story on Deep Space Nine that's just completely disconnected from the A story. Particularly in the early seasons, that was something that they did. Like, Jadzia is training a new Trill initiate, and back on the station they're dealing with a pocket universe that they have to decide what to do with. Those two events are not related at all in the story. So something on TNG that they would always do is they would try and like dovetail those those two stories, at least they would have the same theme, but Deep Space Nine didn't always do that, especially when they were finding their footing. But this is season 6. So this is the point where their storytelling is like really polished, and you basically expect every episode to be a banger. So it's kind of like knowing where this fits within the series, you would expect the B plot to be more thematically relevant to what's going on in the A plot, I guess.
It was related. It was just kind of silly.
Yeah, it was related. It was just, not, it didn't feel necessary. Yeah. It felt like you could have taken the corgi part out of it. And what I kept wondering was, they're walking this dog on the promenade. So we had a golden retriever up until recently, and every time without fail, if we take her for a walk, she will wait until we are as far as possible from anywhere to throw away her poop, and that's where she's going. And so I just kept thinking, how much like dog poop is on the promenade while they're like walking him around everywhere? And
somebody's got to clean the promenade just from the foot traffic.
I mean, I know that, but I was just thinking like, oh man, there's like dog poop on the promenade. Yeah, so there's probably some future way that they take care of it. But I thought about it, especially when Kira like had it on a leash and Odo was walking by. I was like, that little guy's gonna have to go any minute now, and you guys aren't gonna know what to do.
Well, that's the thing. So, like we never do we ever see any animals on the station at all ever,
besides tribbles.
Yeah,
I'm reaching. So the first time Zek appears, he brings his Kurlan Niskos or whatever, that weird long thing, and I think he makes Quark kiss his scepter and then kiss the animal at one point. That's their like one episode. It's more like they mention them. Like Martok mentions his favorite Targ from when he was a boy, and you know, things like that.
Well, because like Data had Spot, but he actually was living in his quarters.
Exactly.
So that kind of made it seem like Starfleet didn't have a rule against, you know, having animals with you. Because, you know, for Deep Space Nine, even though it's not inherently a Starfleet station, it's run by Starfleet, and they talk all the time about how they're going to follow Starfleet policy. So I'm just kind of curious. I'm like,
well, I think it would be looser.
Where they've been the whole time, or did they decide that, hey, since we're on the frontier for frontier medicine, that maybe we shouldn't have animals here because this is more of a war station than an exploration?
I honestly don't know, because it's something they never get into. But which it's fascinating that they don't get into that, because they do address having kids on the station. And they also have episodes where they address where Sisko's like, we can't enforce the rules as strictly here because we're co-governing this station with Bajor, and also we're a port for like all these other races to come in that aren't necessarily affiliated with the Federation. So sometimes we have to be a little more loosey-goosey with stuff, because this isn't like a Federation starship where every single person aboard signed up with Starfleet and is a member of the Federation. So I kind of view it as like, it probably wouldn't be a problem, but it's one thing to see Spot in Data's quarters. It's weird to see animals like running around the ship or the station for whatever reason. I don't know.
So there could be dog poop all over the promenade, and we've just never seen it before.
That's why they never can't pan the camera down to their feet, you know, when they're walking around.
Yes.
So
we were talking about Odo earlier, and one thing I noticed about Odo is that for some reason I felt like the special effects in the comic weren't as good as the makeup effects on the show. Like his face was just like pale, bright, and completely smooth, except around his eyes where it was like super wrinkly, and it just made me think of like taking an older actor and putting face makeup on them and getting all the way up until their eyes, and then seeing their wrinkly eyes from behind this face mask. Like that's what it looked in the comic, and I'm like, you're drawing this. Why wouldn't you actually draw it to look like the intention, which is he just can't make the facial features of the character? Instead, you kind of made it look more like an actor in makeup, which I don't think Odo really looked like on the show anyway.
No, he never looked like an actor in makeup to me. Even, and maybe if we saw it remastered in HD, we would change our mind. But I think all the makeup on Deep Space Nine in particular was really good. The Jem'Hadar were really cool design. They looked very unique from everything else that we'd seen. I don't know, the Vorta, really all the races that we see. The Cardassian makeup was very like convincing and looked like it was a part of them. So yeah, I never got that feeling from the show necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't necessarily something I noticed, but I have a few thoughts about the art, but not really a lot. But I can tell you that this artist, Angel Hernandez, is known for doing media adaptation comics. So a lot of his background is in, okay, take this thing that was on TV and now we're going to make a comic book, whether it's Arrow, whether it's a couple of different sci-fi shows, there's another CW show, and then a whole lot of Star Trek. So this is kind of his wheelhouse. I did feel like for the most part, everybody was recognizable, at least.
Yeah.
So I didn't have trouble telling who was who, which in the X-Files comic, there were times where I had a little bit of trouble going like, wait, who is this again? Because it was so light on detail. This isn't overly detailed either, but at least I was able to follow who was who for the most part. So
there was a shot of Cisco somewhere that I felt didn't really see Avery Brooks do a whole lot.
Oh, sure.
And it was
the one where he's like screaming.
It was either that or he's like looking angry or something, and
Yeah.
it just looked weird. I'm like, that looks very different from Cisco, but
yeah. So the one for me is where he's like screaming at one point. You just don't really see that a lot on the show. But the big art mistake that bothered me was at one point, Dax is on the holodeck and she orders a batleth, and the weapon in her hand is clearly not a batleth. It looks super weird. It's kind of the shape of that bladed weapon, but it looks a lot closer to the sword of Kahless because it was like huge, gigantic, and it was just like polished, like reflective silver all the way across with no like bands for her to hold on to or anything. It just, that weapon was like totally off model what she said in the dialogue. So that was the only thing that like glaringly I looked at and I was like, no, you're wrong. But you know, it did. Again, I don't think it really took away from the story too much. It was just one of those things that as a Star Trek nerd, I'm like, I can't let this go. It should look like the batleth. So
one of the like kind of oddities I found was with the Corgi himself, where he was given a collar and it had like a little Starfleet logo, which was, you know, really cute. But then when they're on the holodeck, you see Garrick kneeling next to him, and suddenly Latinum, the Corgi, has on this like vest that has the same kind of red design that Garrick's outfit has. So I completely missed that, just reading it through, and then suddenly I was noticing like, well, sometimes he's wearing a collar and sometimes he's wearing like a cute little sweater vest that looks familiar. And so I went back and saw that it looked just like Garrick and he was kneeling next to him. So I guess that was supposed to be a subtle, like Garrick knitted something for him to wear.
It looks like Garrick made something to fit him.
But then like if you look throughout the rest of the issues, sometimes he's wearing the vest and sometimes he's wearing the collar, and there's nothing to clue you in why he's wearing one or the other. It's like, so every time Quark took Latinum out in public, Garrick was there going, hey, put this on him. Hey, put this on him. And then when he went back to Quark's quarters, he is like, no, you can't keep that. Let me have it. And Garrick would take it back, and then he's stuck in his quarters with the collar. It was just,
wow.
It was weird. It goes back and forth. And I'm like, is that an issue with the artist, or am I missing something?
So it looks like, at least from the point where he got captured on, he didn't have the vest, he had the collar. He had to have something. It would have maybe made more sense for it to be the vest, but he had to have something because they had a tracking device in him, which is how they were able to track down where the Borg technology was and you know, get that working and everything.
Yeah.
But
which that made sense because that was in the collar, but it was just this vest just kind of showed up out of nowhere, and then sometimes it was there and sometimes it was not. And I was getting distracted reading this comic by looking at what is the Corgi wearing, and maybe that's because I'm a dog person. But...
well, it felt kind of fan fiction-y to have Garrick knit something for the dog, because I don't think that's really within his character.
Well, maybe that's why there's no dialogue associated with it, where they're just like, here you go, we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fun visual gag, but it didn't feel like something that he would actually do. Garrick is a good tailor, which, you know, he actually bemoans that fact on the show, because he's like, this is not what I want to be doing, so it sucks that I'm actually good at it. But
well, I can understand that.
right. Yeah, there you go. But there were a lot of callbacks to other Star Trek episodes and shows.
Oh yeah,
which
quite a bit.
That was something that I thought was really cool. so much so that I started reading into stuff and like looking for more callbacks than were actually there, because whenever there was a buyer and he was like looking for rare one-of-a-kind things from Quark, I was like, oh, it's Kivas Fajo. That's the guy that wanted Data on TNG in the episode The Most Toys, because everything he had was like one of a kind.
Yeah.
He has like, you know, this one-of-a-kind plant and this one-of-a-kind piece of clothing, and he's like, but for your ship, I want Data, the android. And he keeps like telling him to take his clothes off and all this stuff, and you know, it'll be better for the guests if you're not wearing a Starfleet uniform.
He should have been there for episode 3 of the season 1.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
The Naked Now.
That's funny. I wonder if they actually drew him to resemble him, or if that was just a coincidence. But yeah, that totally makes sense.
You just see him in silhouette when Quark's talking to him, and then later you see that it's some guy that kind of looks like a Riemann. I don't know. It was like some like really alien looking guy.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I was expecting that reference because this is a very reference heavy book, but it wasn't there. So
one that I noticed that I liked was a callback to the Nth Degree, where Barclay is hit from an energy surge from the Argus array, which is like this giant Federation astronomical telescope in the outskirts of space. He receives an inexplicable boost of confidence and a vast increase in his knowledge, which ultimately, you know, fizzles out in the end.
They failed with the Argus computer and with the computer on board the shuttle, but they were able to reprogram me.
But it's funny because Barclay's kind of like the comic relief almost, because like they call him Broccoli behind his back, and or sometimes to his face on accident, like Picard.
I look forward to your report, Mr. Broccoli. Barclay.
If you will excuse me.
And then suddenly he's just like super smart, but it's too much for him to process and be able to control. And so they do like kind of a similar thing in the comic where Sisko's got this Borg device and it happens similarly, but O'Brien actually points it out. He's like, hey, this happened when I was on the Enterprise D, like this same kind of scenario. So you need to watch out because, you know, it could have the same result. And I thought that was cool because we do that a lot in Star Trek, where we kind of like have a similar storyline to something we've seen before, but we don't always have the people there to say, oh, I remember seeing this, but sometimes they'll say like, oh, there was a mission log, you know, from the original Enterprise that has mentions that term. You know, they did that a lot on TNG, but I thought it was really cool that O'Brien was here going, hey, you know, hey, I used to be on the Enterprise and my impression of O'Brien really sucks, but this happened to a friend of mine, you know, so we got that callback. So that was.
How do you do sort of a raspy Irish accent? It's very, very difficult to capture what Colin Meaney sounds like. So
let birds go further loose, maybe. Shout easy play.
Chief, you're not making any sense.
But yeah, that was really cool. I liked all the things that tied it to previous continuity, actually. And that's one of the ways that we were able to root this story in where it took place, actually, is that they were doing enough callbacks that we go, okay, so Sisko's talking to Admiral Ross about the Romulans and the Klingons, and he's like, so we have these 3 different forces that are supposed to be working together against the Dominion, but they're not like communicating very well, they're not playing together very well. And while that didn't ring true for me thinking about them and the Klingons, because at this point in the show, they've been working together for the whole season. So like, all right, they've got that stuff figured out. Martok's kind of been leading the charge. He gets along well with Worf, he gets along well with Sisko, and they don't have problems. But the Romulans, it does make sense to me that they would be like, well, we should take point in this encounter because we have superior technology. We should take point here
and superior attitude
and do all this. And because that's very like in line with kind of the Romulan mindset that we've seen in the shows. So I actually thought it was kind of cool how this story, by using that callback to the episode of like, oh, we just brought the Romulans into the war, it also manufactured a problem that makes sense fitting within like this section of the show. Because I think in the show, we actually see them go from the Romulans have been brought in to everything's going fine with them, basically. And here they're kind of like, no, there were hiccups and they didn't immediately get along with everybody. And it was like a problem. And that actually makes sense. And it feels like if the show was longer that they probably would have told that story. So I don't know. I kind of liked that because it yeah, it was just logical and it fit within the
it made
canon.
it fit in.
So
what kind of started to get me is when they did the callback to attention Bajoran workers.
Attention Bajoran workers.
And I immediately thought of the meme first, where you see Dukat, and then it's like, something goofy that they're saying in the meme. But in season 3, episode 7 of Deep Space Nine, Civil Defense. So Sisko, Jake, and O'Brien accidentally trigger an old Cardassian security system that believes the occupation is still going on, and the station has been taken in a Bajoran workers' rebellion. So that was a whole episode. And so to get a callback of it in the comic, I started to feel at that point, I was like, this one feels a little gratuitous.
Yes.
Like, why are we doing this? We've already done this. We've kind of already explored that in a whole episode. And why are we calling this back, towards the end of the story when we've already had kind of the more important callbacks, that we've already had up until this point. So that one for me started to kind of be like, okay, it's starting to feel forced.
I would agree that one to me felt out of place, and just like it was an unnecessary complication at that point in the story. I do think that the A story about Sisko dealing with the Borg implant and what was he going to do with it, and his feelings of resentment and all that stuff, that was strong enough that they didn't need to insert more complications to the story. They could have just kind of focused on that, and I think it would have been good enough.
Yeah.
I was a little bit unsure about Sisko having his insecurities about the Borg reopened, because while I don't view Picard as a character that ever totally got beyond that all the way, it feels like Sisko kind of got over it in the premiere episode of Deep Space Nine. You never see or hear from the Borg on DS9 again after that point. And the feeling is that he kind of like he doesn't really apologize to Picard at the end of Emissary, but you feel like he's moved past it a little bit, and like it's not haunting him like it was before. This is also past the point in the show where we've had Mirror Universe Jennifer, and she's alive, and she's trying to get him to come back to the Mirror Universe, and there's that whole thing. And then he kind of realizes after it's over that, like, wow, I really am done with that chapter of my life. Like, I've moved on, I have Cassidy now, and that's, the direction that I'm going. So it, to me, bringing up his connection to the Borg, I wasn't sure if he would really have that deep of a struggle with it, because it did kind of feel like he's had character development to move him past that.
He was still getting the flashbacks to the Saratoga and it blowing up and, leaving Jennifer behind and all. Like, he was having these constant flashbacks of that, which, would be kind of weird, because we dealt with that. Like, that was the whole point of the pilot, was that, the prophets who exist outside of time are saying, well, you're saying you exist in time, but we can see that you're existing in two places at once. You're in the present, but you're also in the past, because you're reliving this moment over and over, and you're grounded to that. And, 5 years later now in season 6, he's really, like you said, he's dealt with that. He's sort of moved on to the best of ability. He's seeing somebody again. I mean, that was a huge thing that took forever to get him to actually be open to dating Cassidy. And, we finally get that. And that's right. This kind of feels like a step in the wrong, or a step backwards for him. A step
backwards for his character. Yeah.
Especially because now it's like, that brings up Picard too, like, and he doesn't really, I think there's one kind of mention that, Picard was involved, or something about Locutus getting over his assimilation. Like, what's it like for people who are unassimilated or de-assimilated or whatever you call it. But we don't really deal with that too much. And I'm kind of thinking, like, isn't Picard really the person you would want to talk to and ask for advice in this situation? Like, hey, we have a Borg implant. There's no nanoprobes. There's no detectable threat that, we're going to get a whole bunch of Borg swarming at us. It really does seem like this piece of technology has been, disabled down enough that the bare functionality is you can take care of computer systems that are nearby or networked. Like, this seems like something that would be good for the Federation. What do you think? Like, let's work together on it. Like, he'd be the one person you could probably trust.
Exactly. And so you had something in your notes about, like, does it feel like Sisko, like, should have been influenced by his opinion from Wolf 359 more and stuff like that? And I personally think that this point in Sisko's development, that's not haunting him. And I also think Sisko does take the plunge to try the technology himself, because this, again, the Romulans have just joined. This is right after Sisko's had his biggest like moral compromise moment, where he had to cooperate with Garrick to bring the Romulans into the war. And they got somebody killed in the process. And that was something that he, had to live with after the fact. But they start this story, or they have as a component of the story, he's still getting casualty reports from Admiral Ross. And it's like, okay, that's still an ongoing problem. The Romulans are in, but we're not out of the woods. And so it did make sense to me within his character for him to be like, all right, we're going to use whatever we have to try and fight this battle. But I don't necessarily trust Starfleet to do it. I'm going to look at it. So that did make sense to me for the most part, just because I feel like Sisko is kind of desperate at this point in the show.
Right. Well, all of Starfleet is, though.
Exactly.
And that kind of brings to light, like, Admiral Ross is really a nice guy for not telling Sisko, I order you to send this off because we need it. But surely somebody would have caught wind, like an organization like Section 31. Would they really, they would have found out about this. Would they really sit idly by and let Sisko play around with Borg tech because he feels like he needs to trial it before he can give it to Starfleet? Would anyone else in Starfleet really say, hey, you know what, why don't you let us know how that goes? No, they'd be like, this is a turning point in the war that not only could we defeat the Dominion and come out on top, we wouldn't need the Romulans to do this.
Right.
And I feel like somebody in Starfleet would have had a huge ego that's like, if we can do this without the Romulans, we will find a way to do it and we will tell no one. So that Borg tech, like, I would have expected that there'd be ships docking every hour to come and bother him about what's going on instead of just leaving him alone.
Yeah, there was the ship, the Magellan, that was there. And so they were originally going to take the technology and bring it back to Earth. And I guess Sisko convinced Ross to keep that from happening.
Yeah.
It makes sense that they have that relationship because Ross and Sisko have been friends for a couple seasons now at this point. And they even, I think, were together on a starbase when they were planning to take back Deep Space Nine and, that whole thing. And he had Sisko coordinating all the Starfleet activity in the area. So they built a good relationship where they trust each other. But yeah, Ross is not all of Starfleet. And as we see later in the show, Ross even is willing to temporarily coordinate with Section 31 if he thinks it's going to help them win the war.
Right.
Because there's a whole episode where that happens. And, Bashir is like completely betrayed, but I don't know how to say all the Latin, but the name of the episode is like Inter Arma Enum Silent Legis or something like that. But that one, Ross actually does cross a moral line as well, because he's like, we've got to win this war and we need to, manipulate what's going on in the Romulan government so that they stay on our side, basically. So he is also kind of a pragmatist that is willing to do what it takes to win. So I don't know. It's interesting. And it is one of those things that if you expand it out to like all of Starfleet, we've seen so many evil admirals during the run of DS9 and definitely TNG. There were plenty of them. Eric Pressman is the one that always comes to mind for me. That the one that wanted to get the phase cloak from the Pegasus. He's the admiral that I always think of as like the evil admiral. But we've seen that there are plenty of people in Starfleet like that. So you're right. I mean, it seems like especially Section 31, because I don't know that I feel like Section 31 makes a lot of sense or is integrated into the shows very well on the other shows. Maybe I could make the argument for Enterprise, but most of the time when we see them, I feel like it's unnecessary because they're secrets and we're not supposed to know what they're doing. But on Deep Space Nine, they're very integrated into what's going on with the show at this point. And they will be for the conclusion of the show as well, when we find out, like, oh, they invented the plague that's infecting the changelings, basically. So, yeah, they would 100% have had Sloan on the station, like, the next day after that technology arrived. So, and they would have been like, now, Doctor, you need to help us acquire this technology,
Yeah. Although you could argue they didn't have this Borg tech there for very long, because it's only a couple issues, and as soon as they get it and Quark tells Sisko about it, they play around once with it in the holodeck, and then it's gone and they have to get it back, and then once they get it back they destroy it. So you could argue maybe there wasn't enough time, like maybe Section 31 did catch wind of it. Maybe other people finally heard about it, but by that point it was already destroyed. So
sure,
you could kind of argue that one away, but it's just things like that like when I was reading this, I felt like it was a Deep Space Nine story. All the familiar players were there. It was enough that I believed that it was a Deep Space Nine story, but there were some things that kind of just hit me kind of weird that were making it a little bit of a bumpy ride. And I think that just kind of comes from like being a super nerd where you're like unraveling every single little strand and, well, does this fit? Well, where's this at in the continuity? Well, in this episode, like we talked about, like, well, this happens and that would shift the character this way. And it's a lot to keep track of that maybe they missed the mark on a little bit, or maybe we're just being a little critical on, because like I said, Section 31, their involvement could be explained away with it just wasn't enough time elapsed. This is like a single day and then all of a sudden, it's over. So we could probably argue back and forth for a lot of those points, but I think ultimately it's that like tone, it's that feel that gives it that makes you believe that this is actually part of the Deep Space Nine universe.
Sure. And if I'm honest, this was a very complicated point to try and shoehorn a story in, because there is so much going on with all the different characters at this point in the show. Even though, I mean, there was more going on during the era where they were off the station, actually, because it was shifting all over the quadrant to what was going on with the various characters. But this is still really season 6 and 7. It's hard to fit events in there because everything is so serialized by that point in the show. They did still have one-off episodes, but there would still be some element in the background that tied into the overall narrative. So in this story, the thing that tied in was obviously, what do we do with the Borg technology? And, the brokers are planning to sell it to the Dominion. That's really bad for us because that would end the war in their favor. And so then that gives us kind of like that extra urgency that we need in the third act to kind of like kick it up to, more intensity. But
I didn't think that it needed that, though, because we, especially the point of story that this is at, everything is very intense. There's a whole lot going on. And an episode or a side story about, a corgi that everybody falls in love with and has to rescue in a side mission, that would have been the perfect diversion from, hey, we just got the station back. We're trying to figure out what we're going to do to win the war. We have a little bit of downtime while we figure out what we're going to do and lick our wounds. Let's have this corgi episode and have some fun on the side. And then we'll go back to serious. But now I feel like we've opened this can of worms with like, well, where did this Borg technology come from? Was it truly benign to the degree of it would not call the Borg in and everybody would get assimilated, but you actually could wield it as a computerized weapon that maybe somebody could learn if they, tried over time, or if they did some more research, or maybe there's a way to tone down the intensity of the device and make adjustments so that way a normal person could, or maybe we could have it networked out to like 5 people. So 5 people wear it at the same time and they're collective. That's probably the wrong word, but them as a group, not as an assimilated group, could so that there's all these like additional story points that come from this that you would ask afterwards, like, well, it'd be really nice if we had that Borg tech if Cisco hadn't destroyed it, and Starfleet asking about it, like, hey, you made a call that you should have made. But it seemed like we just sort of tidied this one up, it's over, and then go back to watching the show.
We're never going to mention it again. One of the things about the Borg tech that this is another question that I have only because of later continuity, not previous continuity on Deep Space Nine. But I was like, Cisco, as we know, by the end of the show, is part wormhole alien, at least. So would he actually be able to adjust to the implant better than what we see? Because he is able to go into the wormhole at the end of the show and exist in nonlinear time. So I would almost think, and this is also past the episode where he encountered Bahala and like the lost city that he uncovered on Bajor, and he was having all the visions and stuff. And he had a moment in that episode where he's like, I understood it. I understood everything in the universe, the war, why everything was happening and all this. And I kind of thought, like, for Cisco to be the one to put it on, I almost wonder if he should have been able to adjust and control it better than like the average human, especially because he's already had that kind of quasi-religious experience with the prophets, so to speak, and then we find out later that he's actually not purely just a human guy. I was kind of like, I wonder if maybe he would be the perfect person to put this implant on and keep it there. So, but none of that is really addressed. So I don't know. And I realized that they can't reveal that to the audience at this point in the story because it wasn't revealed at that point in the show. But looking back on it now, it's kind of like, well, maybe he would be able to handle it. I don't know.
Well, this was published in 2023, so they can certainly give us spoilers from what happened in 1999.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, maybe that's why he did as well as he was able to do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's how he was able to push himself and be able to rescue everybody and delete their system data from the broker ship or whatever,
right?
And survive that encounter. Maybe that's how he was able to survive too. See, and that's how I feel like a lot of the stuff in this story, like you see it and then you're like, well, maybe not really, but then you're like, well, maybe there is a way to explain it, and it's kind of like,
but it's not on the page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but things like Garrick putting the vest on the dog, like that was on the page, but it was so subtle that I missed it the first time around and didn't really even. It took me a moment to realize that's what was going on, because I was like, well, the symbol is the same, so he must have made it. So there's a lot of stuff in this that's like callback specifically, like to where they actually like tell you this is what happened and I was there, or there's callback as they kind of just like throw things in here and there that like, is this a callback? Is it not? Is it a mistake? Was it on purpose? I don't know. It kind of makes me wonder about, some of the points in the story, if it was on purpose or not even.
Well, it does. Ultimately, what I kind of ended with, and we're kind of probably moving toward final thoughts soon, but what it did make me feel by the end of it was the way to move forward writing Deep Space Nine comics is probably not to try and fit them within the framework of the show. It's probably to do future stuff, and let's see what happened after the show. I know that there's a trade out there called God Shock where Sisko returns, and then here's what happens after. And I am interested to read that, because that's like a big story point that they just leave hanging and we never see resolved at the end of Deep Space Nine. So this story kind of convinced me that like maybe trying to shoehorn stuff within the narrative of the show for this one specifically is not something that we should attempt, I guess. I don't know. I think you can do it with Voyager. I think you can do it with TNG, because they have serialized elements, but they're much lighter. They're not as heavy on that. But season 6 of DS9 is just like, we're moving from one event to the next pretty quickly. So
speaking of moving from one event to the next, do we want to move into final thoughts, or was there anything else you wanted to discuss first?
Yeah, I think I'm ready.
All right, let's move on over.
We like
Comics.
because they have no bones.
So really the biggest disappointment for this, to me, that would take away most of the points would be that the Corgi was not more important to the story. That's why I wanted to read this. That's why I showed up to this. It's called The Dog of War, which there actually is a Deep Space Nine episode called The Dogs of War. So this is the dog singular of war, because it's about a little corgi who gets the name Latinum, but really doesn't do any warring, and it's really just in the middle of wartime, and is really just kind of more collateral than anything else in the story. So that really just kind of disappointed me. Like, I wanted to see more of the corgi.
Yeah.
But aside from that, like, it was cool to revisit this point in time of Deep Space Nine, and I like that even though they did try to kind of shoehorn it in, it sort of fits within and kind of makes you nostalgic for that era of the show. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it too. So I think if I were to give this a numerical score, it would be something that was, I enjoyed it. It's enjoyable. I have some nitpicks, but they don't really make me enjoy it less. It's more just kind of that like fun intellectual exercise of being a nitpicker, as Star Trek fans often do.
Yeah.
So I think I would give this a 3.5, because
it's
not in the middle where it would be a 3 where I'm like, kind of, sort of, or not. But I feel like it did enough that I enjoyed it. But even though there's still kind of some gripes. But overall, like I said, the most points are taken away for just, I wanted to see more Corgi, man. Like, come on.
Yeah.
So 3.5 out of 5 bananas for me.
So it's interesting. We are going to be a little bit different this time, but not majorly. But I try to go into our discussions without having a predetermined score in mind. And with this one specifically, I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to land on. So the discussion has kind of helped me figure out like some of my gripes and stuff like that. But I think I'm going to end at a 3 because honestly, the Corgi being primary or the Borg storyline being primary, one of those two things would have fixed it for me as like, oh yes, this is a valid episode of Deep Space Nine. But the uneven tone really did bother me, where we're kind of moving back from like, okay, this is a little more comedic scene, and now we're talking about the war and Sisko's trauma and all this stuff. And there were enough little nitpicks with continuity, like things about like where Sisko's character is at this point, and should he really even be having flashbacks about the Borg anymore? I mean, medicine and mental health stuff is like so much more advanced in their future than it is now. So we're like, yeah, maybe 6 years down the line, in our world, you would still be dealing with stuff like that. But Sisko really had that moment, and they've kind of moved beyond it, at least in the narrative of the show. So I think that it was enjoyable and that it's worth reading. But if I was going to like recommend a comic to somebody to be like, hey, you should get into reading what IDW is doing with Star Trek or what they're doing with Deep Space Nine, I probably wouldn't start them here, because I felt like there were, and it's funny because normally I'm the guy that's like, oh, this story has so much potential, and I feel like it does. Normally I will give points just for you swung for the fences, you had a great idea, and maybe you missed it by a little bit. But I felt like really the idea of the Romulans not cooperating with them super well, I would have liked to see more of that explored. I would have kind of liked to see them tie in Sisko's wormhole heritage and like maybe explained, oh, that's why he can handle the implant. You know, just some of those things to do with continuity of the show, I would have liked them to weave in a little bit more. But the ultimate thing that I'm taking points away from is one of the first things we talk about, and then that is that the voices of the characters were just not quite there. And that, I think, bothered me more than anything else, because this is my favorite Star Trek show, and I know how these characters sound, and they all have very distinctive points of view. And while their dialogue was communicating the narrative well enough, and they felt like they were mostly in character, it was like, maybe you said the thing, but that's not how he would say the thing, you know? And it was noticeable. So I think I'm going to give it a 3. I don't think it's a bad story at all, but I wish that they would have picked one lane to commit to. And honestly, like you, I would have been fine with a nice, let's have a break from all the heavy stuff happening in the war episode, because they do that on the show too. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, we've had a lot of heavy stuff. Let's have a Ferengi episode where Quark has to dress up like a woman in order to prove how great Ferengi business women are. You know, it's, I don't know how people feel about that in 2024, but I thought it was hilarious back in the day. So, yeah, I mean, it would have been fine if they were willing to just go, hey, this is a lighter adventure with these characters. So, yeah.
I think for a property that is your favorite, that you know so much about, that you have watched and relived over the last 20 years, you know, that a 3 is actually a really high score for something like this, because it's got enough that if you're like, hey, if you like Deep Space Nine, you'll like this comic. Yeah. If you're really into it and you really consider all the implications and everything of the story growth that the characters have had over the 7 years of the show, you could find some stuff wrong with it, but it's still, you know, enjoyable. Is there, you know, are there comics out there that probably are more enjoyable or more within continuity or more exciting or contribute more to the show, you know, even though it's been over for a long time? Probably. Yeah. But this is not one that's bad. It's not like the stuff that we reviewed before where we're like, this is just like, it doesn't match the tone, or they copied something, or there was nothing in here that we were just like super negative about, of like, no, that just ruined it. So,
no, it was more like it just left us with questions, and hey, they could have used this bit of lore, or they could have done that, and, you know, just kind of spinning the possibilities in our mind of how they could have maybe improved it a little bit. I do remember that when we reviewed Next Generation Hive, that I gave it a 2.5, because I felt like people were like wildly out of character and things were just happening in the narrative because that's what we wanted to happen. And so I knew going into it that it was going to be higher than that because this wasn't executed in a way that I felt was incompetent, you know? So, so yeah, 3 for me, 3.5 for you. That's a pretty good score.
Yep. Well, that should wrap it up for this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones is the name of our podcast, or Boneless Comics Podcast for short. Make sure that you rate us on your podcast platform of choice, and also comment, like, and subscribe on YouTube, and check out our after shows where the discussion continues.
That's right. And tell us what you think of this comic by posting on social media at Boneless Comics Podcast, or on X! At Boneless Comics 1, using the hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast for all your questions and comments. And next episode, we're going to discuss the limited comic series Star Wars Thrawn, written by Jody Houser, illustrated by Luke Ross, and published by Marvel Comics in 2018.
Yep, and it is based on the New York Times best-selling novel by Timothy Zahn, also called Thrawn. But this
Thrawn
is
by Zahn.
Yeah, so this will be a different one for us because it is a comic that's based on a book, which is in a movie TV universe, as opposed to being a direct adaptation or insert into something that's already in movies. Or so this will be an interesting.
But is it canon?
That's a good question. So find out next time. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you later.
Catch you later.
We like
Comics.
because they have